Welcome to session 20 of our class on the Conquest. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 13, and we have seen in the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel how God empowered David to defeat Israel's enemies and establish and expand the kingdom. And then in the next two chapters, chapters 11 and 12, David committed the sins of adultery and murder and deception. His days are dark and disappointing, but he still depends on the Lord. And the Lord enables him to overcome and prepare the nations for the reign of his son Solomon. What life does to us depends on what life finds in us. And in David was found a strong faith in the living God. Absalom is the chief character in this part of the drama that we come to now, because it was Absalom who helped to turn the drama into a tragedy. The three heirs to David's throne were Amnon, David's firstborn, Absalom, his third son, and Adonijah, who was born fourth. 1 Chronicles 3, 1 and 2. God had warned David that the sword would not depart from his house, back in chapter 12. And Absalom, whose name means peaceful, was the first to take up that sword. David's judgment against the rich man in Nathan's story was that he shall restore the lamb fourfold, chapter 12 and verse 6. And that judgment fell upon David's own head. Bathsheba's baby died. Absalom killed Amnon for raping Tamar. And Joab killed Absalom during the battle of Mount Ephraim. And Adonijah was killed for trying to usurp the throne from Solomon. David was reigning over Israel, but sin and death were reigning within his own family. God had forgiven David's sins, but David was discovering that the consequences even of forgiven sin are very painful. God had blessed David with many sons, but now the Lord would turn some of those blessings into curses. Jeremiah 2 and verse 19 says, "Your own wickedness will correct you, and your backslidings will rebuke you." The events in chapters 13 and 14 unfold like a tragic symphony in 5 movements. From love to lust, from lust to hatred, from hatred to murder, from murder to exile, and from exile to reconciliation. Absalom is mentioned first in chapter 13 because chapters 13 through 19 focus on the Absalom story, and Tamar was Absalom's full sister. Both Tamar and Absalom were noted for their physical beauty. Their mother was Maacah, a princess from the royal house of Talmai in Geshur, a small Aramean kingdom near what we know as the Sea of Galilee. David had no doubt taken Maacah as his wife in order to establish a peace treaty with her father. The fact that Absalom had royal blood in his veins from both his father and his mother may have spurred him on in his egotistical quest for the kingdom. Amnon was the oldest of David's sons and the apparent heir to the throne, so perhaps he felt he had privileges that the other sons didn't have. It was evil for him to nurture an abnormal love for his half-sister, and he should have stopped feeding that appetite the moment it started. The sin was not only unnatural, but it violated the standard of sexual purity established by God's law in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, and Deuteronomy 27. However, Amnon became so infatuated with Tamar that he really thought he loved her, and he became sick thinking about it. The virgin princesses were kept secluded in their own quarters, apart even from their male relatives, and Amnon's imagination worked overtime as he thought about her. Now Jonadab was Amnon's cousin, and he was a very crafty man, probably a minor official in the palace. He will show up again in chapter 14 and verse 32 after Amnon has been killed by Absalom's servants. Anybody in our lives who makes it easy for us to sin is certainly not much of a friend. In fact, by following Jonadab's advice, Amnon ended up becoming a rapist, committing incest, and getting killed. This proves to us that we should choose our friends carefully. Amnon must have begun to recover from his lovesickness because he had to pretend to be ill when David came to visit him. Perhaps Amnon was thinking, if my father committed adultery and murder and got away with it, surely I can get away with rape. Well, such is the destructive power of a bad example. Proverbs 25 and verse 26 says, if the godly compromise with the wicked, it is like polluting a fountain or muddying a spring. David's family was now polluted, and the consequences would be calamitous. David was known for his wisdom and keen insight, but after the incident with Bathsheba, he seems to have lost ground. By ordering Tamar to obey her half-brother's wishes, he sent her into pain and humiliation, even unknowingly. And when 2 years later David allowed Amnon to attend Absalom's feast, he sent his firstborn to his death. David the deceiver was himself being deceived. Tamar baked the special cakes for Amnon, who asked everyone to leave so he could enjoy the meal with his sister, and then he forcibly violated her. What he thought was love was really only lust, a passion that so controlled him that he became like an animal. Of course, she resisted him as long as she could. Her refusal to cooperate was based on the law of God and the responsibility of the nation of Israel to be different from their pagan neighbors. David's sin had given occasion to the enemy to blaspheme God. Her use of the words folly and fool in verses 12 and 13 remind us of Genesis 34 and also Judges chapters 19 and 20, which were two other despicable rape scenes in Scripture. Tamar tried to stall for time by suggesting that he asked the king for permission to marry her, even though she must have known that such a marriage was prohibited by the law of Moses, again according to Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, and Deuteronomy 27. Amnon thought that he loved Tamar. First, he was distressed over her, according to verses 1 and 2, and then he became sick thinking about her, verse 2, even to the point of looking exhausted in verse 4. But after he committed the sin, he hated Tamar intensely, and he wanted to get rid of her. True love would never violate another person's body just to satisfy selfish appetites. Nor would true love try to persuade someone to disobey the law of God. In his desire, Amnon confused lust with love and didn't realize that there's a fine line between lust and hatred. Before he sinned, he wanted Tamar all to himself. But after he sinned, he couldn't get rid of her fast enough. Well, sexual sins usually produce that kind of emotional damage. When you treat other people like things to be used, you end up throwing them aside like something that is broken. The word woman is not in the Hebrew text of verse 17, so Amnon was basically saying, throw this female out. He doesn't even name her, and he just refers to her as a female. Throw this female out. Well, this explains why Tamar accused Amnon of being even more cruel by casting her aside than by raping her. Having lost her virginity, Tamar was not a good prospect for marriage, and she could no longer reside in the apartments with the virgins. Where would she go? Who would take her in? Who would even want her? How could she prove that Amnon was the aggressor and that she hadn't seduced him? Well, she went to the apartment of her brother Absalom, because in a polygamous society, it was the responsibility of a full brother to protect the honor of a full sister. When Absalom saw her tears, her torn garment, and the ashes on her head, he realized that she was in great pain and humiliation, and he deduced that Amnon had violated her. His question, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you?" reveals this, for the phrase "been with you" was a euphemism for "gone to bed with you." Palace gossips don't miss much, so it's probable that Absalom heard of Amnon's illness, quote unquote, and Tamar's intended visit to his apartment. But if Absalom was so concerned about his sister, why didn't he warn her to stay away from Amnon? Absalom's cunning brain was already at work on a scheme that would accomplish three things: avenge Tamar, get rid of Amnon, and put himself next in line for the throne. While these things are not said in the text specifically, we do have the statement, he tells Tamar just to keep quiet, to don't say anything, and that he would take care of it. And we also know that later he will try to take the throne from his father. His statement to Tamar, "He is your brother," means if it were any other man, I would avenge you immediately. But since it's your brother, I'll have to be patient and wait for an opportunity. It could be that Absalom was trying to avoid a public scandal that would grieve the family and hurt his own plans to seize the throne. King David did hear about the tragedy and became very angry, but what could he say? The memory of his own sins shut his mouth. And how could he punish his firstborn son and the heir to his throne? According to the law, if a man raped a virgin not engaged to be married, he had to pay her father a fine and marry her, and he could never divorce her. Deuteronomy 28, verses 28 and 29. However, the law also prohibited the marriage of half-brothers and half-sisters. So, marriage was out of the question, Leviticus 18 and verse 9. So neither David nor Absalom said anything to Amnon about his wicked deed. In fact, Absalom never spoke to him at all, neither good nor bad, but simply waited for the right time to kill him and avenge his sister. However, Amnon's friend Jonadab knew that Absalom wanted to kill Amnon, for he said, "By the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar," as we will see in chapter 13 and verse 32. If Jonadab figured out what was going on, perhaps others suspected something also. Amnon's lust had turned to hatred, but now it was Absalom who was nurturing hatred in his heart, and that hatred would give birth to murder. Then, with Amnon out of the way, Absalom could become king. The French author Émilie Gaboreau wrote this: "Revenge is a luscious fruit which you must leave to ripen." For 2 years, Absalom waited to avenge the rape of his sister. But when the time came, he was ready to act. Thanks to the generosity of their father, the princes not only held government offices, but they also owned lands and flocks and herds. Absalom had his land and flocks at Baal Hatzor, about 14 miles north of Jerusalem. It was customary in Israel to arrange great feasts at the time of shearing the sheep and to invite members of the family as well as friends to share the festive occasion. Absalom asked his father to come to the feast and bring his officials with him, but David declined, explaining that so many guests would be an unnecessary financial burden to his son. Absalom was probably hoping for that kind of response because he certainly didn't want David and his guards present when Amnon was murdered. Then he asked if David would permit his successor, Amnon, to attend the feast, a request that made David feel apprehensive. But David knew that the crown prince often took his place at public functions that demanded royal presence, so why couldn't he represent the throne at Absalom's feast? Furthermore, 2 years had passed since Amnon had violated Tamar, and Absalom hadn't done anything against him to this point. So probably there's not much of a chance he's going to do anything now. To guarantee some kind of safety for Amnon, David went the extra mile and permitted all the adult king's sons to attend the feast, assuming that Absalom wouldn't dare attack Amnon with so many of his family members present. But during those 2 years, Absalom had perfected his plan and made arrangements for escape. His father David had arranged for the murder of Uriah the Hittite and had survived, so why shouldn't his son Absalom survive? Like his father, Absalom used other hands to do the deed, and at a time when the victim least expected it. David had made Uriah drunk, but had failed to achieve his purpose, while Absalom made his brother drunk and accomplished what he had set out to do. Absalom followed his father's evil example and committed premeditated murder. When Absalom gave the command and his servants killed Amnon, the princes at the feast fled for their lives, no doubt convinced that Absalom was planning to wipe out the royal family and take the throne. The young men mounted their mules, which were considered animals fit for kings, and they hastened back to Jerusalem as fast as the animals could move. But Absalom also fled, and probably his servants with him. In verses 30 through 36, which are a parenthesis, we move from Baal Hatzor to Jerusalem, and we see the escaping princes from David's point of view. Before the guards on the wall could clearly observe the men riding furiously toward Jerusalem and recognize them as the king's sons, a messenger arrived from Absalom's house announcing that all the king's sons had been killed. The fact is that bad news travels fast and is often exaggerated. David tore his garments and fell to the ground in grief, no doubt blaming himself for allowing his sons to attend Absalom's feast. David's nephew Jonadab, who knew more than he admitted, gave the true account that only Amnon had been killed. But even this was a terrible blow to David, for Amnon was his firstborn and heir to the throne. The fleeing princes arrived safely, and everyone joined in expressing grief because Amnon was dead and Absalom was the murderer. The problem with revenge is that it doesn't really solve any problems, and eventually turns around and hurts the perpetrator. As Francis Bacon once said, in taking revenge, a man is but even with his enemy, but in passing it over, he is superior. No one was treated more unjustly and inhumanely than Jesus Christ at his trial and crucifixion, yet he refused to retaliate. And he is our example. The old slogan, "Don't get mad, get even," may satisfy some people, but it can never be pleasing to the Lord. The Christian way is the way of forgiveness and faith, trusting the Lord to work everything out for our good and His glory. Twice we're told that Absalom fled in verses 34 and 37 of chapter 13, and he probably did it during the confusion that ensued when the king's sons fled. Only Absalom and his guilty servants knew what was going to happen at the feast, so everyone else was caught unawares. they were all witnesses of the murder, and they could easily testify that Absalom was guilty. Absalom fled 80 miles northeast to the home of his maternal grandparents in Geshur, where his grandfather Talmai was king. No doubt this safe haven had been arranged beforehand, and it's likely that Talmai would have enjoyed seeing his grandson crowned king of Israel. Back in Jerusalem, David mourned over his firstborn son Amnon, but in Geshur, the exiled son was no doubt plotting how he could take the kingdom away from his father. Normal grief heals in time, and after 3 years, David was comforted concerning the death of the crown prince. The statement in verse 39, "And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom," has been given at least two interpretations. It means either that David wanted very much to see his son again, which is understandable, or that David planned to go after Absalom and deal with him, but his anger gradually quieted down. Concerning this latter possibility, if David had really wanted Absalom back home, he could have accomplished it very easily, since Joab was for it also, and David's in-laws in Geshur probably would have cooperated. However, when Absalom did come home, David kept him at a distance for 2 years. If the king was anxious to see his son again, he went about it in a peculiar way. It may be that a struggle was going on in David's heart. He knew that his son deserved punishment, but David was known for being lenient with his sons. Possibly, David initially planned to deal severely with Absalom, but decided against it as his attitude changed. As explained in chapter 14, David compromised by finally bringing Absalom home, but he punished him by delaying full reconciliation. It was 5 years before father and son saw each other face to face. Concerning the other possibility that David really wanted to see his son from the beginning, we have the statements and actions of David later when Absalom is killed, which show how much he loved Absalom and grieved mightily over his death. In the first place, when Absalom takes over the throne and the two armies go to battle, David says in 2 Samuel 18 and verse 5, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." In the second place, 2 Samuel 18:33 states, "The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." So when Absalom is killed later on, David went so far as to say that he wished he could have died in Absalom's place. So I would think that the phrase, "and the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom," means exactly what it sounds like. David truly wanted to have Absalom back with him. Well, this brings us to chapter 14. David loved his son and undoubtedly was convicted about the way he had pampered him. But how could he get out of this dilemma? Well, Joab provided the solution to the problem. Just as Nathan had confronted David the sinner by telling him a story, so Joab confronted David the father and king by putting a fabricated account of a family problem into the mouth of a woman who was both wise and a very good actress. She came to the king dressed in mourning and told him that about her family troubles. Her two sons had had an argument in the field, and the one killed the other. The other relatives wanted to kill the guilty son and avenge his brother's blood. But she opposed them. Killing her only son would have put an end to her family. According to the law, the surviving son was guilty and should be killed. But she wanted the king to pardon her surviving son. Nathan's story about the lamb touched the heart of David the shepherd, and this story about a warring family moved the heart of David the father. His first response was to assure her that he would take up the case, but that wasn't good enough for her. Sometimes the wheels of government turned slowly, and her case was a matter of life and death. When she said she would assume the guilt of whatever decision he made, David promised to protect her if anybody approached her about the matter. But the woman still wasn't satisfied, so she asked the king to take an oath to assure her that her son would not be slain, and David agreed. Taking an oath in the Lord's name was binding and could not be ignored. The woman now had David in a corner. If he had agreed to protect a guilty son whom he did not know, how much more was he obligated to protect his own son whom he loved? She had come to him with a matter involving the future of one small family, but the matter concerning Absalom concerned the future of an entire nation. The king didn't want to see her only son and heir destroyed, but he was willing for the crown prince to be left in exile. He forgave the murderer of her son, so could he not forgive the man who plotted the murder of Amnon? How much longer will the king wait before he sends for his son? After all, life is brief, and when life ends, it's like water spilled into the earth and can't be recovered. Slaying the murderer can't bring back the victim, so why not give him another chance? God is no respecter of persons, and his law is true, but even God devises ways to show mercy and forgive offenders. He punishes sin, to be sure, but he also seeks for ways to reconcile sinners with himself. Had he not forgiven David's sins? The woman confessed that she was afraid that her family would kill her son and rob her of the inheritance God had given them. Well, it was a stirring speech, and David took it to heart. But being a wise man, he realized that the full impact of the woman's plea went far beyond the boundaries of her family and property. David had insight enough to know that she was speaking about himself, about Absalom, and the future of the nation of Israel, God's inheritance. At this point, he also must have understood that the entire story was pure fiction, and that somebody else was behind all that the so-called widow had spoken. Then the truth came out that indeed it was Joab who had plotted the whole thing. But his motive was a noble one. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. Verse 20. No doubt it was Joab who brought the woman to have this audience with the king, and he probably remained in the room and heard all that the woman and the king said to each other. David had sworn to protect the woman and her son, so the king could do nothing but allow Absalom to come home. And he ordered Joab to go to Geshur and bring the exile back to Jerusalem. Joab's words in verse 22 may suggest that he had discussed the subject with David on more than one occasion, and he was overjoyed that the matter was now settled. Geshur, as we've said, was about 80 miles from Jerusalem, and Joab would waste no time making the journey. So Absalom could have been back home a week or 10 days later. However, there were restrictions placed on the crown prince. He had to remain on his own land, which almost amounted to house arrest, and he wasn't allowed to go to the palace and see his father. Perhaps David was testing his son to see if he could be trusted. Or David may have thought that these restrictions would assure the people that the king was not pampering his difficult son. However, these limitations didn't hinder the expansion of Absalom's popularity, for the people loved and praised him. The fact that he had plotted the murder of his half-brother and had proved his guilt by running away meant very little to the people, for people must have their idols, and what better idol than a young, handsome prince? Lack of character was unimportant. What really mattered was status and wealth and good looks. In contemporary language, Absalom was a he-man, someone with manliness, and the people envied and admired him. The fact is, times have not changed. Whatever Absalom may have had, one thing he did not have was a large number of sons to carry on his famous name. The three sons mentioned in verse 27 must have died very young, because chapter 18 and verse 18 informs us that Absalom had no sons living at that time. We aren't surprised that he named his daughter after his sister Tamar. Always the egomaniac, Absalom erected a pillar to remind everyone of his own greatness. Well, a deceptive wise woman could see the king's face, but the king's own son was banished from his presence. Absalom put up with this arrangement for 2 years, trusting that Joab would bring about reconciliation between himself and his father. But Joab did nothing. Absalom knew that being banished from the king's presence meant that he wasn't expected to be heir to the throne, and more than anything else, Absalom wanted to be king of Israel. A shrewd man like Joab must have realized that Absalom had designs on the throne, and that the prince's growing popularity could provide him the support that he needed to take over the kingdom. Knowing how volatile the situation was, the wise general stayed away from Absalom lest he give the impression that he was being controlled by the egotistical prince. After 2 years of waiting, during which he had summoned Joab twice and been ignored, Absalom decided that drastic action was necessary. He commanded his servants to set fire to his neighbor's barley crop, and his neighbor happened to be Joab. This got the general's attention, for the law required that an arsonist repay the owner of a field whose crop he had destroyed. People knew about the fire, so Joab could visit Absalom without fear of being misunderstood. Absalom presented Joab with two alternatives. Either take him to the king and let him receive his son and forgive him, or take him to court and prove that he was guilty of a capital crime and deserved to die. Absalom would rather be killed than go on living in shameful house arrest. Joab was on the horns of a dilemma, for it was he who had masterminded Absalom's return to Jerusalem. Joab knew that the people would never permit their favorite royal personage to be tried and convicted of a crime. But how could Joab guarantee that the king would be reconciled to his son? Well, Joab gave Absalom's message to David, and David invited his son to come see him. And the king received him with a kiss of reconciliation. Father and son were together after 5 years of separation. But there was no record that Absalom was repentant, and there's no record that he sought his father's forgiveness, or that he visited the temple and offered the required sacrifices. Father and son were together again, but it was a fragile peace and not a real one. Absalom still had his hidden agenda, and he was determined to seize David's throne. But now that the prince was free, he could be visible in the city and enjoy the adulation of the crowds, while at the same time quietly organizing his sympathizers for the coming rebellion. David was about to lose his throne and crown, his concubines, and his trusted advisor Ahithophel, and ultimately he would lose his own son Absalom. It would be the darkest hour in David's life. This brings us to chapter 15. It's one thing to experience God's power when you're facing giants or fighting armies, and quite something else when you're watching people tear your world apart. God was punishing David, but David knew that God's power could help him in the hour of pain as well as in the hour of victory. He wrote in one of his psalms, "Many are they who say to me, there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head." Psalm 3, verses 2 and 3. David recognized that God's loving hand of discipline was upon him, and he admitted that he deserved every blow. But he also believed that God's gracious hand was still at work in his life, that the Lord has not forsaken him as he forsook Saul. The Lord was still working out his perfect will, and never did David rise to greater heights of faith and submission than when he was forced to leave Jerusalem and hide in the wilderness. In these two chapters of chapter 15 and 16, we are introduced to three kings. First, there is Absalom, Israel's counterfeit king. If ever a man was equipped to be an agitator and lead people astray, that man was Absalom. He was a handsome man whose charm was difficult to resist, and he had kingly blood in his veins from both his father and his mother. The fact that he had no character wasn't important to most of the people who, like sheep, would follow anybody who told them what they wanted to hear and give them what they wanted to have. Newspaper editor H.L. Mencken's definition of a manipulator is rather extreme, but he gets the point across. One who preaches doctrines he knows to be untrue to men he knows to be idiots. Novelist James Fenimore Cooper expressed it accurately. One who advances his own interest by pretending to have a deep devotion to the interests of the people. Again, those are two definitions of a manipulator. Absalom was not only an absolute liar, but he was a patient man who was able to discern just the right hour to act. He waited 2 years before having Amnon murdered, and now he waited 4 years before openly rebelling against his father and seizing the throne. When you read some of the Psalms of David, you get the impression that at this time King David was sick and didn't have his hands on the affairs of the kingdom, therefore giving Absalom opportunity to move in and take over. With great skill, the egotistical prince used every device at his disposal to mesmerize the people and win their support. David had won the hearts of the people through sacrifice and service, but Absalom did it the easy way and the modern way, by manufacturing an image of himself that the people could not resist. David was a hero, but Absalom was only a celebrity. Sadly, many of the people had gotten accustomed to their king and now took him for granted. Absalom's campaign must have begun shortly after his reconciliation with his father, for now he was free to go wherever he pleased. His first move was to begin riding in a chariot pulled by horses and accompanied by 50 men who were his bodyguard and who announced his presence. The prophet Samuel had predicted this kind of behavior by Israel's kings, and Moses had warned against the acquisition of horses for selfish purposes. David wrote in Psalm 20 and verse 7, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God." Absalom met the people personally on the road to the city gate when they came early each morning to have their grievances examined and their cases tried. The city gate was the city hall of the ancient cities. Absalom would greet these visitors like old friends and find out where they came from and what their problems were. He agreed with all of them that their complaints were right and should be settled in their favor by the king's court. It was flattery of the most despicable kind, but the people loved it. Absalom boasted that he would handle kingdom matters better if only he were a judge, which was a subtle way of criticizing his father. When people started to bow to him because he was the crown prince, he reached out his hand and stopped them, pulled them to himself, and kissed them. This reminds us of the hypocritical kisses of Judas when he greeted Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It took only 4 years for Absalom's magnetism to draw together a large number of devoted followers throughout the whole land. The people Absalom met returned home and told their friends and neighbors that they had spoken personally to the crown prince. And over the 4-year period, this kind of endorsement gained Absalom many friends. Absalom had been deceiving his siblings and the Jewish nation for years. And when the right time came, he took a bold step and lied to his father. The prince was no longer under house arrest, so there was no need to get permission to leave Jerusalem, but in so doing he achieved several purposes. First, he could tell anybody who asked that he had his father's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill the vow he had made while exiled in Geshur. Second, it allayed any fears that might arise because of Absalom's former feast at which Amnon was killed. Third, it gave credence to his invitation to 200 key people in David's administration who willingly attended the feast. When the guests saw these 200 important people in Hebron, they must have been impressed. The fact that this was a feast connected with the fulfilling of a vow gave it the atmosphere of a religious assembly, for sacrifices were offered to the Lord. What could go wrong at a feast dedicated to the Lord? Absalom was now using the name of the Lord to hide his sins. Well, Absalom's masterstroke was to win the support of Ahithophel, David's smartest counselor. And when the guests saw him at the feast, they felt confident that all was well. But Ahithophel did more than attend the celebration. He also joined Absalom in revolting against King David. It was probably Ahithophel who masterminded the entire operation. After all, David had violated Ahithophel's granddaughter Bathsheba, and he had ordered her husband to be killed. This was Ahithophel's great opportunity to avenge himself on David. However, in supporting Absalom, Ahithophel was rejecting Bathsheba's son Solomon, whom God would choose to be the next ruler of Israel. At the same time, Ahithophel was taking steps toward his own death because, like Judas, he rejected the true king, and he went out and committed suicide, as we will see later. Ahithophel had deceived David his king, and he had sinned against the Lord, who had chosen David. Why did Absalom decide to start his insurrection in Hebron? Well, for one thing, it was the former capital of Judah, and perhaps there were people there who resented David's moving the capital to Jerusalem. Absalom was born in Hebron and could claim special kinship with the residents. Hebron was a sacred city to the Jews because it was assigned to the priests and had a connection with Caleb, all the way back in Joshua 21. It was located about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem, and it was a walled city and the ideal city from which to invade Jerusalem and seize the throne. With 200 of David's officials imprisoned behind Hebron's walls, it would be simple for Absalom to take over the kingdom. Absalom and Ahithophel had their trumpeters and messengers ready to act, and at the signal the word quickly spread throughout the land. Absalom is king. He reigns from Hebron. The anonymous messenger who informed David actually helped to save the king's life. However lethargic David may have been before now, he immediately moved into action because David always did his best during a crisis. His first official order was for his family, officials, and special bodyguard to leave Jerusalem immediately. If Absalom had the whole nation following him, it would be easy for armies from Judah and the northern tribes to surround Jerusalem and leave no way of escape. David knew that the same Absalom who killed Amnon would also kill his brothers and possibly even his father, so it was imperative that everybody flee. Furthermore, if Absalom had to attack Jerusalem, he would slaughter the inhabitants, and there was no reason for hundreds of innocent people to die. It was just like David to risk his own life and abandon his own throne in order to protect others. The servants pledged their loyalty to the king, and so did his bodyguard. The 10 concubines David left behind to manage the household would be violated by Absalom, as we will see in chapter 16. This was an act that declared that he had taken over his father's kingdom, as we have noted in previous lectures. Well, in verses 17 through 22, David and the people with him escaped to the northeast, moving from Jerusalem opposite the direction of Hebron. When they came to the last house in the suburbs of Jerusalem, they rested, and David reviewed his troops. These included David's personal bodyguard, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, as well as 600 Philistines who had followed David from Gath and were under the command of Ittai. Ittai assured David that they were completely loyal to the king. This Gentile's testimony of fidelity to David is one of the great confessions of faith and faithfulness found in Scripture, and it ranks right up there with that of Ruth in Ruth 1:16 and the Roman centurion in Matthew 8:5-13. In verse 23, we find that David weeps. The key word in this section is passed over or crossed over, which is used 9 times. David and his people crossed the Kidron, which in the winter flowed very powerfully on the east side of Jerusalem and had to be crossed to reach the Mount of Olives. The scene reminds us of our Lord's experience when he went to the garden. At that very hour, Judas, one of his own disciples, was betraying him and arranging for his arrest. This was in John chapter 18. Well, coming back to 2 Samuel, the people wept as they quickly moved along, and their king wept with them, though perhaps for a different reason. His own son had betrayed him, along with his friend and confidential advisor. And the foolish people for whom the king had done so much were ignorant of what was going on. Was David feeling the weight of guilt as, once again, Absalom, his beloved son, defied God's will and broke his father's heart? He and his son had been reconciled, but the young man had shown no remorse for his sins, nor had he asked forgiveness from his father, nor had he asked forgiveness from the Lord. The sword shall not depart from your household had been the gloomy sentence from the mouth of God's prophet back in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and it was being fulfilled. Bathsheba's baby had died, and Amnon had been murdered. David didn't want Absalom to die, but the young man would be slain by Joab, the third installment, so to speak, in David's painful payment. Adonijah would also die in an aborted attempt to become king in 1 Kings chapter 1, and then the debt would be paid. For the second time in his life, David is forced to flee into the wilderness to save his life. As a young man, he fled the jealous rage of King Saul, and now he was seeking refuge from the hypocritical deceptions of his son Absalom and his former counselor Ahithophel. By leaving Jerusalem, David had spared the city a bloodbath, but now he and his family were in danger. And what was the future of the kingdom? And what was the future of God's covenant with David? Well, we know how the account ends, but the people involved in it at the time may not be so sure of the outcome. On the other hand, we know God had promised that David's line would continue in the form of his son Solomon. Therefore, Absalom will not be successful. David's faith in God would have shown him that. We come now to chapter 15, verse 24 and following. And in this chapter, or in these passages, we see Jehovah, Israel's sovereign king. And we see this also in the Psalms of David. We can't help but see David's trust in God and his conviction that no matter how disordered and disturbed everything was, the Lord was still on his throne. No matter how David felt, he knew that the Lord would always keep his covenant and fulfill his promises. Psalm 4 might well have been the song that David sang to God that first evening away from home. And Psalm 3 may have been what he prayed the next morning. In Psalms 41 and also 45, he poured out his heart to the Lord, and the Lord heard him and answered in his own time. In Psalms 61, 62, and 63, these Psalms allow us to look into David's troubled heart as he asked God for guidance and strength. Note that each of these 3 Psalms ends with a strong affirmation of faith in the Lord. We today, if we are faithful, can have courage and assurance in our own times of difficulty as we see how the Lord responded to David and his great needs. Zadok and Abiathar shared the high priestly duties and had helped to bring the ark to Jerusalem, so they thought it wise to take the ark to David. Absalom had usurped his father's throne, but the priest would not allow him to have the throne of God. They joined David's camp and brought many of the Levites with them, and Abiathar offered sacrifices. And no doubt David called upon God to guide and protect the king. But David told them to take the ark back to Jerusalem. He didn't want the throne of God treated like a good luck charm as in the days of Eli when the glory departed from Israel. Absalom and his men were trying to turn David's glory into shame. But God's favor was upon the king, and he would restore him to his throne. David had seen God's power and glory in his sanctuary. Psalm 63 and verse 2. And he would see it by faith there in the wilderness. But even if God rejected David, the king was prepared to accept God's sovereign will. Back in 1 Samuel 3 and verse 18, Eli had made a similar statement. But his was a statement of resignation, not dedication. In David's case, the king was totally yielding to the Lord and saying, "Not my will, but your will be done." Faith without works is dead. So David assigned the two priests to be his eyes and ears in Jerusalem and to send him all the information that would help him plan his strategy. Zadok's son, Ahimaaz, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, would be the messengers and bring the information to him. David was a gifted tactician. And when you read 1 Samuel chapters 19 through 28, you discover that he had an effective spy system that kept him informed of Saul's every move. David would have agreed with the counsel attributed to Oliver Cromwell. Put your trust in God, my boys, and keep your powder dry. Whatever Absalom might do to the king's officials, he wasn't likely to lay hands on the Lord's priests and Levites, and they could go about their work almost unnoticed. When the two priests and their sons returned to Jerusalem with the ark, Absalom's followers must have interpreted their action as 4 votes for the new king. Well, David was a strong and courageous man, but he wasn't afraid to weep openly. In fact, real men do weep, including Jesus and Paul. We read about David's tears in Psalm 6, as well as in Psalms 30, 39, and 56. In Psalm 6 and verse 8, it says, "Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity, for the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping." Psalm 51 and verse 17 says, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise." Well, David certainly had much to weep over, for his sons had brought sorrow and death to his family. Amnon had been murdered, and Tamar violated. And now Absalom, the king's own son, was in the process of usurping the throne of Israel. And as we already know, he was heading for certain death. David's friend and counselor Ahithophel had turned against him. And the people for whom David had often risked his life were abandoning him to follow an egotistical rebel who was never chosen by God. Well, if ever a man had a right to weep, it was David. Like disobedient children being spanked, it's easy for people to weep when they're being chastened for their sins, and then forget about the pain when the spanking is over. But David's tears went much deeper. He was not only concerned for the welfare of his rebellious son, but also for the safety of the nation and the future of Israel's God-given ministry to the world. God's covenant with David, as noted in 2 Samuel 7, assured him that his throne would last forever. And this promise is fulfilled in Christ. But the promise also implied that Israel would not be destroyed or the lamp of David permanently extinguished. God would be faithful to keep his covenant, and David knew that his throne was safe in the hands of the Lord. Another messenger arrived in David's camp and informed the king that Ahithophel had deserted him for Absalom. In Psalm 41 and verse 9 we read, "Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." And in Psalm 55 verses 11 through 14, part of that reads, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. But it was you, a man my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance." What do you do when one of your closest friends betrays you? Well, you do what David did. You pray and you worship. Verse 31 of this chapter says, "O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount, he worshipped. And then David saw Hushai, who was the answer to his prayer. Hushai is called David's friend in verse 37, which implies that he was a friend at court and a special counselor to the king. He was an Archite, which means he came from a group of people who descended from Canaan and thus were Gentiles. The town of Archa was located in Syria, about 200 miles north of Damascus and 5 miles east of the sea. David's conquest had reached that far north, and some of the people had begun to worship the true God of Israel and to serve God's king. As he had done with Zadok and Abiathar and their 2 sons, so David did with Hushai. He sent him back to Jerusalem to act as his spy. All 5 men were taking risks for the sake of the Lord and the kingdom, but they considered it an honor to serve their king and help restore him to his throne. All of the people to whom David gave special assignments could say, "We are your servants, ready to do whatever my Lord the King commands." This would be a fine statement for believers to adopt today as an expression of their devotion to Jesus Christ. Hushai came to Jerusalem just as Absalom arrived, and the people's excitement at greeting the new king probably enabled Hushai to enter the city without being noticed, or perhaps he strengthened his position by joining the crowd. Of course, later Hushai would greet the king and go to work doing all he could to obstruct his plans and keep David informed. If there's one thing better than getting an answer to prayer, it's being an answer to prayer. And Hushai was the answer to David's prayer. Humanly speaking, were it not for Hushai's counsel to Absalom, David might have been killed in the wilderness. This brings us almost to the end of an hour, but it also brings us to the beginning of chapter 16, and we don't want to start a new chapter with just a minute or 2 left. So we'll stop here, and we'll pick up with 2 Samuel chapter 16 in session 22. As always, if you have any questions or any concerns about what I've said in the class or about the class itself, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.